I am terrified, Cliff. I am
You
terrified.
are.
Yes,
I,
because I
I
have a
think I know why you're terrified.
well, I have a computer,
That's good.
and I am looking at Twitter,
Hmm.
and
Clearly, you're one of those modern people.
I am one of those modern people. Lindsey Graham has tweeted out that we have never seen more threats against our nation and its citizens than we do today.
Not just never, but never, ever, ever, never.
Never.
It
And
is. It's scary. I mean, if you look at the whole history of this country, clearly we've never seen anything like this. No one's ever attacked us here. There never was a war, for lack of a better term, that was civil. We, if you, particularly if you were certain kinds of Americans, like let's say Native American or African American, you've never had anything that's. I mean, life's been pretty cheery overall. No one's ever attacked you, and I can't think of any real wars we've had. So he's right.
apparently, there was a
That Cold
time
War thing,
back in
right?
the 60s where we were rather close to an all out nuclear war, is my understanding, too. Which,
Yeah, but would the nuclear missiles that have hit us had ISIS guys on them?
right.
No, they wouldn't have brought ISIS to America, the way clearly President Obama's adherence to the Muslim Brotherhood is doing right now.
Now, Lindsey Graham is obviously running for president, and
Or
he's
king of the closet.
or I should say, running for the vice presidency. And
When I said the closet, by the way, I meant he may have left some things in there like clothing, and so he might have to go look for it. And that's all I was getting at. Just to be clear, Go ahead.
he's running for the vice presidency, and in doing so as the sort of, I guess, the expert on trying to terrify the American people and drum up some type of threat. But what's interesting, the reason why I raise that, because look, Lindsey Graham does that. It seems to me every 6 weeks he says that, and has literally been saying that for at least 15 years almost now.
Yep.
That I am aware of.
No, I mean certainly. I mean, I don't know if he was probably saying it when he was in the House, right around when he was impeaching that threat, Bill Clinton.
Right.
But I don't know if anybody was listening much. But certainly since he's been in the Senate, which is around at least 10 years now, right? He's joined the McCain caucus and can't shut up about how the world's coming to an end.
Now, what's interesting about this is because this is exactly the rhetoric we saw that led us into the war in Iraq. I mean, literally the same type of rhetoric, the same type of hyperbole. Obviously, it had more resonance then for the American public because we were so close to 9/11 and people, I think, were still in state of shock. But I raised this because, a couple of weeks ago, with Jeb Bush in the race, we are seeing a lot of, the question of Iraq, and I guess also with ISIS taking Ramadi this week, which is, I think, it's not indicative of anything good, but one should remember Ramadi is the capital of the Anbar province, which is essentially where it was Saddam Hussein's hometown, more or less. I mean, I guess it was Tikrit was his hometown, but it was the epicenter of Saddam Hussein's power, and it is the epicenter of those who were de-Baathified, and all those Baathist generals, many of whom are leading or ISIS in many respects. Michael and I were talking about the Fedayeen, which of course was sort of like Saddam Hussein's version of the National Guard or the Palace Guards.
Or the Republican Guard.
Yeah, exactly. In Iran. And so this is, we're hearing a lot more about Iraq and the, it is stunning to me, the revisionist history that's going on.
Yes. So I'd like to quickly move from the comedy of making fun of Lindsey Graham to outrage, if that's okay.
Please.
Here we are sitting here 12 years later, after these people made the biggest blunder in the history of the United States, I mean, certainly at least comparable to Vietnam, if not worse. And this is a guy who's taken seriously, who stands up and says things like this. He was wrong about everything, everything. All right? He wasn't as complicit as George W. Bush was, as far as we know anyhow, and his administration, in the stovepiping of intelligence, in making up false claims about yellow cake in Niger, and then outing an undercover agent who, by the way, her job was to stop proliferation of weapons of mass destruction in Iran, was one of the main things she was doing. And all the other ways in which these guys threatened, intimidated, lied, planted stories, and so that now a bunch of people could say, oh, well, the intelligence was bad. Well, some of the intelligence was bad because clearly even people who weren't part of that little junta thought that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Now, there are plenty of us out there. I didn't know you, I don't think, back then, Sam, but I'm going to guess you were among them, who said, what if they do have weapons of mass destruction? Russia had them, or the Soviet Union, for years, and you see we didn't go to war with them. If there's a secular leader there in Saddam Hussein who cares about his life, which clearly he did, you can actually deter them. Right? It's pretty simple. We've done that before. So this whole idea of taking out the leadership with nothing to replace it with is idiotic just to begin with in simple foreign policy terms. But once again, these guys have proven that they don't know anything. They don't know their whatever's from a hole in the ground, and yet this guy is sitting there making the same case and trying to get us to go back into Iraq and fight ISIS, to get us to go into Syria, to get us to go into Iran. And it's just amazing that he has a microphone and the ability to run for president to do this, because these guys don't know anything. They are the stupidest people. Their foreign policy theories, all the we can go in on the cheap and the oil will pay for it and the flowers and the chocolates, all fell apart. What happened is any student of history and foreign policy would understand, whether you want to look in recent years or go back to, how about the Philippines during the Spanish-American War, where both the Spanish and we failed to colonize. You can't go in and occupy a place on the cheap and just think, yeah, they're going to be happy to have us there, particularly if it's people who don't have a shared cultural history and are completely come from a different background than you do. It will not work. All right. The only way it ever works at all is post World War II. If you think about Japan and Germany and some others, where we are still there, and we pumped a lot of money, tons of money, into those countries. We traded with them, often at a disadvantage to ourselves. We built infrastructure. We did a lot of things, none of which we were willing to ever do in Iraq, and which, by the way, to be even-handed here, we won't do in Libya either. Now, that clearly wasn't as big a mistake because President Obama's not as much of a jackass as these guys are and not as stupid as they are, but that was another place we've created a vacuum now, and look, that's not working either. We can try it as many times as we want. It will never work unless we suddenly say we are going to take billions of dollars and invest in these places to give people jobs and to make them want to embrace the way of life we want them to embrace, but we will never be willing to invest that. So we will create a vacuum, and into that vacuum will step ISIS or other characters like that. It's simple common sense. But this guy wants to be president on that record, on that failed, ridiculous record. It's just amazing to me. It's astounding.
And it's not, and we should be clear, it's not, look, there's a lot of people who have a great investment in making sure that the history of how we went into Iraq is obscured and rewritten. All right. And let's just take that first. There's a couple of different good arguments that I've seen out there in terms of what is important to remind people of. And you're right. I mean, as late, I guess, as February of 2003, in fact, this show, the first Majority Report that ever took place, was Tom Sharpling giving me 2 hours on the best show on FMU to go out there and live do a version of this show. If people think that what I do now is even slightly unprofessional, back then it was pretty stunning. But nevertheless, the argument was the same. We should not be going into Iraq. And the arguments are, and in fact, those arguments have been bolstered since that time. The first being that when the administration talked about weapons of mass destruction, the words weapons of mass destruction have been so conflated and so manipulated.
Yeah.
The idea at the time, and look, anything that I knew at that time was a function of it being written by a reporter, right? I mean, I never had any sources that anybody else didn't have. It's just that I was taking the time to look.
Right. Well, let's say additionally, Sam, we knew the history. So if you knew the history in Iraq, there was reason you could believe that Saddam Hussein had chemical weapons because he had used them.
Yes.
And so
we had given them.
Sure.
Donald Rumsfeld brought them over on a truck practically. But the bottom line is that a ton of sarin gas on a battlefield kills about 100 people. And this is a weapon of mass destruction. Definitionally speaking, it was not what the American public thought it was.
No, they conflated that with mushroom cloud quite purposely.
Yes.
To create the impression that there were nuclear weapons there, which is something that no one ever believed, no legitimate source that I'm aware of, and that Joe Wilson took apart when they tried to pretend, and the Italian, I don't know if it's the Italian Secret Service, the Italian version of the CIA took a look at these documents that supposedly said that they tried to purchase this yellow cake from Niger, and were like, this is ridiculous. And Joe Wilson, of course, wrote about that and when he went there and checked it out. And there's the rest of that history. But one could be forgiven for believing they had chemical weapons, right? They'd used them, and it wasn't impossible to believe that. And there was bad intelligence on that.
Well, there's no doubt in my mind that the administration. There's no doubt in my mind that the administration thought that they would find chemical weapons in Iraq. Why wouldn't you?
And yet plenty of people have chemical weapons, and we always believe that we can deter them.
But here's the bottom line is that did not in any way, the existence of chemical weapons there would not in any way be an existential threat to the United States. It wouldn't even be a threat. It wouldn't even be a threat to significant portions of any large city. I mean, yes, it would be bad if somebody figured out a way of aerolizing sarin gas and somehow getting it to a New York public subway system and releasing it, and you'd probably have, I don't know.
I don't get it. North Korea has worse. Why haven't we invaded them?
You'd have the same amount of people die, maybe as died in that shootout in Waco, Texas the other day. I mean, look, the bottom line is that this was never an existential threat to the country. But then let's go beyond that, okay? Leave that aside. We know this whole thing where if we knew now if we knew then what we knew now, they knew then. The Bush administration lied about the intelligence. They knew they were lying about the intelligence. For
the first time in the history of this country that I'm aware of, certainly what people who are legitimate sources out there have said, they created the stovepiping was the term. They didn't, that Dick Cheney kept firing the people they sent over to give them the daily brief because he didn't want to hear. It's pretty clear when you're firing people, kind of like it's pretty clear when you're outing undercover agents, the message you're sending, it's not just about that person. It's about what you're telling everybody else as to what's acceptable. Criticize us in public, we'll destroy your life. Come to me with the information I don't want to see, you'll be fired. This is really easy stuff. And when we know that Donald Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz, right after 9/11, were talking to Richard Clark and saying, well, there are no good targets to hit in Afghanistan, so why don't we just bomb a completely different place? We also know that
they said bomb specifically Iraq.
Right. Well, that's what I meant by different place. Of course, Richard Pearl had 8 other countries on his list, too, in the book he wrote. Iraq was the beginning. Somalia, Iran, Syria, you go on forever because that's what we should do with our time, our money, and our morality, or lack thereof. And so we know these guys that's what they said. And let's go bomb Iraq. And George W. Bush had a variety of reasons to do it. And Paul, because of his dad and because of other reasons. And Wolfowitz believed that his stupid, inane theory of how a democracy could just spring up in a place that didn't have that tradition and didn't have that history and didn't have the structures to put that in place that was another reason. We'll create democracy in the Middle East. And George Bush, I think, believed that would happen too. It was like all these ridiculously stupid theories with no historical proof, no scientific proof, nothing, all sort of combined to lead to what we did. And every one of them, of course, was proven to be wrong. The whole thing failed.
But it wasn't just wrong. Look, the bottom line was that, this is the fundamental, and James Fallows makes this point too, and you've said it, but I want to reiterate this. And for people who don't understand, I think there's a lot of people who listen to this audience. They are fully versed in how one manipulates that intelligence. Let me just remind people that if you sat in the White House right now and you demanded by explicitly or implicitly, I want intelligence to show that, in fact, there are lizard people walking amongst us. There is no doubt in my mind at the CIA there is a file where somebody has been interviewed who claims that there are lizard people walking amongst us.
Well, Alex
And
Jones
what
is
they would
certain
do,
of it.
the reality is there's a lot more files that say there are no lizard people. That guy is not a credible source. But if you keep saying, like you say, you show up at this White House, and if I got to go down to the CIA 5 times and visit as Cheney did, and make sure that that file ends up being brought to my desk, and that is considered the intelligence, and that's exactly what they did. They did not allow.
Let me say one other thing too, which is, two other things quickly. First of all, in addition to all of that, the whole case that was made there where somehow Saddam Hussein was connected to these people who hated him because he was secular, and he was not a radical Islamist in the manner in which they were. So of course he was,
in any way, frankly.
Right, he wasn't going to work with them. What's his name? Zakari, who was in northern Iraq, was aligned with them, not aligned with Saddam Hussein, not friends. But the way they made this was Dick Cheney, after being definitively told that this BS report about Mohammed Atta going and meeting in Prague with some of the Iraqi intelligence, this was confirmed. In so many cases, he was told that this was just utter crap. And there was literally no legitimacy to this. And then he went on Meet the Press and other shows months after that and kept repeating it. So if he wants to believe he wasn't purposely lying to get us into that war, that if you look at those facts, they don't jive. Okay, it doesn't make any sense unless he's lying his way into that war. They knew this stuff, and so it's not just intelligence failures, of which yes, there were some. These guys did it. But the final point I want to make on this, and I'm not saying we need to stop talking about this, but from my perspective is this is the failure, again, this is where it shows up, the failure of the strategy of President Obama to look forward and not backward.
Yep.
Because the reason why Lindsey Graham can run for president is because no one has ever been held accountable for this. If the people who had perpetrated the acts, who started a war based on lies, who committed torture and broke UN conventions and our own Constitution and the rest, if they'd been held accountable for these actions, if some of these people went to prison, if at least there were high-profile trials, okay, then Lindsey Graham would have been under the microscope for the lies that he told that were fed to him. Maybe we'd know more if he knew what he was talking about and was lying, or just didn't know and was repeating what was fed to him. Either way, he would have a lot to answer for now, which he doesn't need to answer for nearly as much. I mean, we just had the first circumstances where Republicans have come out and said they wouldn't do it again if because of what Jeb Bush said, and the other guys to make Jeb Bush look bad said, no, we wouldn't do it again with that intelligence. And Rubio went so far as to say George W. Bush wouldn't have done it. Well, yeah, he would have. And they've gotten away with all this because we looked forward.
And even I think this is even incumbent upon Hillary Clinton to even though she has said more or less the same thing, even though she recanted that vote years ago, I still think it's incumbent upon her to say, like, this is the lesson I've learned. This is why I would not, and these are the circumstances in which I would not invade a country. These are the.
Well, I wouldn't, and frankly, Sam, I wouldn't even just single her out. I would also say John Kerry. I would also say Joe Biden.
Yes, but she's running for president, and John Kerry's.
I'm talking about way back when Joe Biden was running for vice president. It would have been nice, so that we didn't go another 7 years without talking about this. When John Kerry. Maybe it was too soon to know everything when he was running for president, but certainly as a major figure in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, that we've let this go so many years without these guys forcefully.
Look, they knew
out.
to listen. John Kerry took that vote out of cowardice. Hillary Clinton took that vote out of maybe cowardice, maybe not having as much of a problem with a war like that. In my, it was a calculation, yes, but I'm not convinced that that was like so difficult for her to make in terms of where she is in terms of foreign policy. All that said, because and the reason why I say that is because they knew they were opening the door, and yes. The vote was just to basically empower the president, blah, blah, but they knew. They knew. James Fallows writes about on 9/11 or 9/12, he spoke to someone in the Pentagon who said, we're going after Iraq. Everybody knows it. And there's no way they didn't know that this wasn't on the back burner anyways. And there's just no way.
I think the reason why we've had the decay and why John McCain has been allowed to remain a voice in foreign policy and why Lindsey Graham can run for president is that all these people we're talking about weren't held responsible.
Nobody was held accountable.
But also on the Democratic side, anyone who was that high profile, anyone who was the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who became vice president, who became Secretary of State, these are all people who should have had to come out, not just say why they voted the way they did, but explain what happened. Recant and explain and say why it was wrong and say why they won't make the same mistake again.
Right. Absolutely.
That's an important part of our history that a lot of, as you said, even Democrats, because how many Democrats voted for it? I'm losing my history now, but enough.
In the Senate, plenty.
And 30, I think.
Yes. And we should say that I totally agree with you that when President Obama said, turn the page, move forward, don't look back, unless, of course, it's something that we should look back on. Do all of that. Basically, he was creating a vacuum, and the history was not settled. There was never a time, and so when you allow time to pass, when Judy Miller can walk around and sell her book and it becomes an argument as to whether or not what she did was fundamentally unethical.
And she's defending them too. She's blaming it all on bad intelligence. She's telling the same damn story they are.
Of course, because there's a vacuum that's been created, because theoretically, in the context of our system, the only party or entity that could have held these people accountable decided not to. And so you basically say it's open season. And I want to remind people that regardless of whether or not people thought they were hoodwinked, there was weapons inspectors on the ground at the time that we started the attack. Well, the Bush administration said
up until then, when we
said to the UN, get them out, get them out. And they would have been in there if we had not said, we're about to bomb, get them out. So
that's right. I mean, and the irony of this, all of this also, is that some of the most vocal critics of the president, by not looking back, he's allowed them to remain in their perches, most notably Dick Cheney, where they can write, books that are full of it and go out on little tours with their daughter when she's not getting kicked out of Senate races in Wyoming, and hurt him, frankly, with the things they say about him that a conservative audience wants to hear.
Yep.
But he's allowed them to retain the credibility, and many others along those lines in the Senate and in the House, and your Bill Kristols and people like that out there who write for major publications and go on TV, and it's created, it's allowed these guys to continue to exist and never have to apologize for what they did, and so they've had more legitimacy when they've been in the mainstream media criticizing him.